So Ladybird books have been in existence for 100 years. 2015 sees the centenary. But for most people, the kind of significant moment in Ladybird's history was a kind of golden era, golden period between the very late 1950s through the 60s, 70s, and maybe to the early 80s. And that's primarily because the format that Ladybird had adopted had very much come into its own. The books were designed, if you like, for small, tiny hands. And the kind of social context that Ladybird presented of this kind of utopian view of the world through the lens of Ladybird is one that certainly people of a certain generation have a connectivity or an affinity with. And it was an important part of so many people's childhood. They learnt to read through Ladybird, they were educated through Ladybird books, they understood about history, they understood about, they read fairy tales through Ladybird. And so for most people, there's this strong connection with Ladybird through their own childhood and through how Ladybird presented the world to them. And it was very middle class, it was very non-PC, if we're honest about it. And it presented this idyllic life that not many of us really grew up in the 1960s and the 1970s. If you think about the kind of turbulent changes that were taking place in society through the 60s and the 70s, Ladybird presented, as I said, a utopian view of the world that very much was kind of post-war. It was about the family unit. It was about mummy washing dishes and doing the shopping. It was about daddy washing the car and gardening. And the broader context was also the Ladybird view of the rest of the world through the eyes of the British middle class. So at that point, post-war, Ladybird's view of Britain was still that we reigned, that the colonies were very much still in existence. So I think the kind of cultural significance for Ladybird stems from the importance the books had.
I think there was a lot of my father's personal beliefs and background reflected in Ladybirds, both in the ethos of them and in the realisation of them through the illustrations and the topics he chose, because he was aware that there was a certain amount of injustice in that access to education and knowledge wasn't always equal. We're thinking about back to the 1940s, 1950s, primarily here. And he was very aware that he himself would have liked to have had more education and hadn't been able to have it. He wanted children to realise that the key to success was through knowledge and education and learning, and he wanted to make that process enjoyable and fun so that children wouldn't be put off. And he was also aware that there were quite a lot of adults around who were aware that there were gaps in their knowledge, and he didn't want them to sort of be ashamed of reading what would look like a children's book. So the books, although they were ostensibly children's books, were not something that adults would be worried about being seen with. And I think it's now a sort of well-worn myth, or possibly a true myth, that the Ministry of Defence would use some of the books that they were used by IBM to explain to their staff how computers worked, that how it works, the motor car, was used by Thames Valley Police to train officers in what their patrol cars did under the bonnet when they first started using cars rather than bikes.
I think the People at Work series portrays communities at work, and it portrays communities within work. So the kind of camaraderie of people working alongside each other. There's fantastic illustrations in the Minor which are showing guys hard at work in really grueling circumstances, but there's a kind of pride in the simplicity of that job. I think we've lost somewhat something of our kind of heritage and our understanding of the normal working class graft involved in some occupations, as so much of that was stripped out, I would argue, by Thatcher during the 80s, that the working class were kind of frowned upon. Here the working class aren't portrayed as heroes, but honest, hard-working folk that work for their community, work for their families. And I think that's a really key aspect of British life that needs to be understood and needs to be celebrated. And I think the People at Work series does that in a particularly subtle but real way. And I think John Berry's illustrations depict people, you know, happy with their work, not striving to win the lottery, not striving to win X Factor, but happy with their lot in normal, hard-working roles that contributed to society. And I think that there's a kind of honesty in that I think we've lost along the way. And that's one of the connections that people have with Ladybird, is that very honest view, very simple yet honest view of society at that point.
My father had a very good relationship with the illustrators because he understood what they needed, which was security of knowing what work they were going to get in the future and how long it would last. And they also liked personal contact they had with him. They weren't dealing with an anonymous company, they were dealing personally with him.
Ladybird was very astute. It commissioned only the very best commercial artists. They put them through some pretty rigorous testing before they went on to be commissioned to create a whole book or a whole series. 24 illustrations in each book, so it was a big commitment as a commercial artist. It was a big commitment on Ladybird's part in entrusting an illustrator to undertake 24 illustrations.
He had an understanding of artists and how artists work, not just from his own background of being interested in art and design and enjoying things like lettering and graphic design, but he realized that the detail in the illustrations was extremely important.
Stylistically, things vary. Some of the illustrators chose to work from drawings, some chose to work from photographs, some worked from reference material that they created themselves, some went out and hunted things down.
He was very specific in his instructions to artists, and there again, this is something they appreciated, and they knew where they were with him. They got a very succinct brief, and they got positive feedback and criticism from him. So he was, from that point of view, he was a good person to work with as far as an artist was concerned.
Douglas Keane saw there was an opportunity to create books that had much more educational interest. And he did this through talking to parents, talking to school teachers, talking to those that worked with children. The opportunity to create educational titles could potentially meet a massive audience. So one of the greatest challenges for Wilson Hepworth, the publishers for Ladybird, was in creating a format that worked against a background of paper rationing. What Ladybird did was, working back from the size of the printing press, developed a format of 56 pages that are created out of one single sheet of paper. So every single sheet of paper that fitted that press, you created one Ladybird book. Very, very cost effective, creating very affordable books.
The pricing structure was very unusual and quite extraordinary in that there were no regular price increases in the books from the mid-40s until the 70s. In fact, I think they didn't go up in price until decimalisation.
Here was a format that could be readily produced, that could be printed on a single sheet of paper, that was cost effective, and it meant that Ladybird could enter the marketplace and price the books at 2 and 6.
So my father would cover the whole of the United Kingdom, visiting bookshops, persuading them to buy Ladybirds. And then when the Nature series was developed, the window displays became much more orientated towards the educational books. And he did some particularly good displays using stuffed birds and real branches in windows. And what was attractive about them was the fact that they were all designed for individual shops, and he would work on them with the shop manager, whether this was an individual shop or whether it was a branch of W.H. Smith's or the Midland Educational or any of the other chains of bookshops. And he would then be very careful to get feedback from the manager on what had happened to sales when that display went in. And there were a lot of letters on file from bookshop managers, most of them unsolicited, saying, "We've had a terrific increase in sales after the display. Can we have another display like that for a different range of books?" and so on. The Keywords reading scheme was an idea that was developed by an educationalist and headmaster called William Murray, based in Cheltenham. And his theory was that the majority of our everyday vocabulary is actually made up of very few words. So if you have children learning those words first, then that gives them the key to unlocking sentences and therefore to paragraphs and whole books, because they recognise the familiar recurring words. And my father had met William Murray at a conference, and he was very interested in this idea. William Murray had previously explored the idea of developing a reading scheme with a publisher, and it hadn't got anywhere. But my father persuaded him to do a trial with it, and he saw that the thing that would persuade William Murray was if he could actually see what a book would look like. So my father got his friend and collaborator, the illustrator Harry Wingfield, to do a sample book with the sample characters Peter and Jane, and for which Harry used models of children he knew. So it was very realistic, and William Murray then saw that this would be something that he could sign up to, and he was happy to proceed.
So what I hope people take away from the exhibition is partly a trip down memory lane. I hope that people see an image that they haven't seen in 40, 45 years and they connect with it again, that an image from one of the Well Loved Tales or one of the Peter and Jane books or one of the People at Work makes a connection with them, and those decades disappear in an instant as they recall the moment they connected with that illustration.